Hello and welcome to IHBC at COP26. Conserving buildings and places conserves our planet. Today we are joined by Lorri Ferris. Lorri is the Director of Sustainability and Climate Action at Goody Clancy and a champion for preservation of built heritage as a key measure towards meeting climate mitigation goals. Her professional practice as an architect, structural engineer, and conservator combines broad policy development with deep technical insights to promote a culturally and environmentally sustainable world through design. She is active locally and globally through her roles on the American Institute of Architects Committee on the Environment Leadership Group, the ICOMOS International Scientific Committee on Energy, Sustainability, and Climate Change, and as a co-chair of the Zeronet Carbon Collaboration for Existing and Historic Buildings. Well, welcome, Lorri. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So could we start by asking you to tell us a bit about yourself, how you got started, and why you're passionate about sustainability and conservation?
Sure. So I think my passion for sustainability and conservation, and really for the concept of stewardship in general, was ingrained in me from a very young age. I grew up in southern Louisiana, which is one of the earliest European settled parts of the United States, which has a very strong French Cajun culture to it. So there's sort of this very lovely cultural component to the identity of that region. And at the same time, they've always throughout, I think, history grappled with the Mississippi River and the sort of natural environmental influences on their civilization there. So I grew up with this understanding because it's just taught to you both socially and academically. You learn about how the environment and how history impacts the way you live today. And I think that really, sunk in. And I've always been interested with those relationships, both the relationship with our current culture to our past and the relationship between our current culture and how it's responsive to the natural environment in which it sits. And that kind of led me to study architectural history and building technology and kind of these intersections of how buildings work and how they work now, how they worked in the past, and how we can keep them relevant into the future.
That's really fantastic. Talking about your project work a little bit, I know you do work for large institutional clients, which I think is really interesting to hear about, sort of large buildings, campuses, that sort of thing. So as you are designing for your project work, whether that's new build or maybe you're doing a new addition or renovating existing buildings, how do you go about emphasizing sort of carbon reduction solutions through design?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I think the answer varies depending on the client because in my experience, most of the buildings that we work on for particularly higher education clients are very multifaceted. There are many stakeholders that make up these owner groups. And overall, carbon is not their primary concern. There are constraints around finances and schedule and public perception, all of these other factors. And so I think the most effective way to really bring carbon into the picture is actually to tie it to the co-benefits it has with these other with all these other things. For example, how can reducing carbon also reduce cost? How can it tie into what their student bodies really care about, going to climate action and particularly tying back to climate action planning? How can they talk about it and present it in a way that people can learn from, that they are seen, that they can be leaders within their peer group? How can it tie to resilience? That's a big one, particularly now where owners are actually starting to see the impacts of climate change on their buildings' operations and on the people within the buildings. How can carbon reduction strategies tie to helping their buildings perform better going into the future? So I think it's really kind of a communications game.
Right. Okay. And do you find an acceptance from clients to sort of look maybe longer term in their horizons as far as sort of paybacks, carbon paybacks, maybe a little bit more money in the near term, but benefits long term?
Yeah, I think we're lucky actually to work with higher education institutions because they do typically own their buildings for a very long time. So they are invested in seeing them perform well over time. And so if you can show them, I think they are willing to make a higher investment up front if it leads to energy savings or cost savings over time, or helps them reach a carbon neutrality target, or is easier to maintain. I think there are a lot of reasons why people will invest more upfront. And with existing buildings, I think one thing we found that's interesting is helping people realize the win-win opportunities particularly around deferred maintenance, where something as simple as sealing windows and improving air tightness of a facade and repairing masonry can both be, can help them shuffle deferred maintenance off of their list, but it can also improve their energy use and reduce their costs over time and help their building be more durable over time.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. I guess I'd like to come back in a moment to dig in a little bit more about how you might sort of calculate some of these savings. But first, I wanted to talk about policy, because I understand you're involved in some policy development as well. So could you tell us what your work around this area is about? I know you're working on sort of ingraining carbon and climate accounting into thinking, but how do you sort of, from a policy standpoint, sort of incentivize these things?
Yeah, so I think policy exists at so many different levels, right? So I am involved in policy for different groups. So on one hand, looking at carbon policies for campuses, so climate action planning and carbon neutrality planning. And then on the city side, looking at how the city of Boston in particular and other municipalities can implement the carbon policies. And so I guess I'll start with the campuses, going back from that work. I think one of the challenges with getting clients to prioritize carbon is that they really need it to be explicitly called out in their policies in order to make the case for decision making around that factor, right? So while climate action planning is becoming much more common and I think is starting to have more teeth, just particularly in the United States, we've seen we're still only looking at operational carbon typically with these plans. And so particularly when you're trying to make the case for building reuse, where the benefit is through the avoided emissions of reusing what we already have rather than building new, if there's no policy around embodied carbon, if no one has to track or pay the price for the carbon emissions resulting from the materials and the construction of a new building, then there's no reason to make a decision around that carbon, or there's no incentive to value the existing building for its embodied carbon. So that's one thing we've been working on. Is it's really a lot of education and a lot of helping people to think about the metrics and how they can be easily introduced. One case study, we've been partnering with a college outside of Atlanta, Georgia, to try and quantify the carbon benefits of their stewardship philosophy. And this campus is part of a historic district. They have a really wonderful ethos around stewardship that has to do with the environment and their culture and the social systems on their campus. And they've never been able to really put a number on that. So that's what we're helping them to do, to look back over time and say, over the greater than century of this campus's existence, you've avoided X carbon emissions, which is equaling a huge number, equivalent to growing a forest on their campus for hundreds of years,
Wow.
that just through reusing their buildings, through making that decision and choosing to reinvest time and time again as that decision comes up. And then looking into the future, helping them to incorporate these findings into their carbon neutrality plan so that they are actually thinking holistically about carbon emissions and capitalizing on the benefits of preservation or conservation on their campus.
Yeah, that's amazing. So you talked about sort of quantifying those numbers. I know a lot of times it can be difficult to quantify the numbers. Can you talk a little bit about the tools that you use? And I know that also you've been involved in developing a tool, so you can tell us a little bit about that, if you would.
Sure. So the tool, I guess at a high level, life cycle assessment is the conceptual tool that we use to quantify life cycle carbon emissions. And what that does is really just expand our aperture from not just looking at use phase emissions, which are from the energy use to operate, heat, cool, light a building, but really expanding that view all the way from extraction of materials, construction, through end of life, demolition, et cetera. And so there are a lot of tools available to do this. We have been incorporating life cycle assessment into our work to really start to put a number on the carbon benefits of reuse and of conservation. But the problem with life cycle assessment is that it's quite a detailed process. And so to perform a full life cycle assessment, you really need to know a lot about the building. You need to know all of the material quantities that are going into it. You need to know a lot about its location. And so you kind of have to be at the end of a project and you have to be a fairly knowledgeable professional to perform this calculation. So the tool that I've been working on with Larry Strain of Siegel & Strain Architects out in the San Francisco area and Aaron McDade from Architecture 2030 is called CARE, the Carbon Avoided Retrofit Estimator. And this tool is meant to be used early in design or before design by policymakers, by building owners, by advocates, by design professionals, really by anyone. And it takes this life cycle approach, but it uses standardized data it's pretty high level. It's not extremely precise, but it is accurate enough to allow you to evaluate the carbon impacts of doing nothing to it, to an existing building, of retrofitting it, making certain upgrades to it, improving its energy performance. And then the third scenario is replacing it with new construction. And so that the point of the tool is that, an owner comes to you, for example, and says, I'd really like to understand how reusing this existing building contributes to my carbon neutrality targets or my carbon mitigation targets, because I really just want to build new. I want to build new net zero, but someone's, what happens if I demolish this building? And so this tool allows you to get a snapshot and to see that almost always reusing an existing building, if you can upgrade its energy performance, is the better carbon choice. And I want to emphasize that is particularly within the context of the urgency of climate action, that because we're not looking at carbon payback over an entire building life cycle, what we really care about are carbon emissions within the next 10 to 15 years. And so when you kind of narrow your window to that time frame, the embodied emissions, those upfront emissions, matter so much more than operational emissions. So building reuse is just, it hugely capitalizes on on avoiding emissions from new construction within the critical near term.
Right, that's amazing. So that's sort of an early phase tool. So is it something that an owner could use, a sophisticated owner, or is it more targeted that they're sort of architects early on?
Yeah, it's absolutely targeted towards owners, policymakers, people who don't necessarily have technical training in architecture. It's very simple. It's a series of drop-down menus. You enter the size of the building, where it's located, and then you can tell us a little bit about the renovation. So you input into the tool sort of, are you upgrading the mechanical systems? Are you renovating the interior, and to what extent? And you can it's very quick to toggle these options. You can actually play with it to understand the carbon impacts of different choices. But the idea is that you don't need to know a lot technically, and you don't need to know a lot about your specific project in order for the tool to be effective.
Right. Okay, that's great. Is it and so you're in development with the tool, or can we find it out there and use it, or where is it now?
It's in development right now. We're about to hire a web app developer. So it's been in a spreadsheet form so far, which works just fine. But I think once we get it onto the web, then we'll be able to share it out more widely and update it more consistently, and really kind of link to more data. I think that's one constraint of Excel, is just the amount of data that you can fit in there. And so, for example, we've been working through the Climate Heritage Network, which I know we'll get to in a few minutes, to look at how the tool can be expanded. Currently, the data within it only covers North America. So looking at expanding it to cover other regions of the world. And once it's out of Excel, we can sort of easily plug in other backend data to allow, for example, people in the UK to use this tool and have data that's regionally specific to them.
Yeah, and that's always the tricky part, isn't it? With especially existing buildings and the various building typologies. Is it one of these things where you can gain metadata on buildings as it's used more, and gain insights and sort of improve the software as it goes, or?
That's an interesting question. I would love to be able to do that. I suppose it has to do with the permissions that we receive from users as they're using the tool to anonymize the data and be able to harvest it. But that's a really good idea, because I think that's one of the biggest data challenges around advocating for conservation as climate action, is that we just don't have a large data set with these numbers. We have a few case studies which are impactful, but it's not the same as having a database of hundreds of buildings.
Right. Now, you mentioned the Climate Heritage Network, and I suppose that ties into your participation in the Zeronet Carbon Collaboration, where, you're looking to sort of break down barriers between silos of practitioners, between sort of more mainstream practitioners and conservationists. Could you tell a little bit about what your goals are there? And
yeah, absolutely. So the Zeronet Carbon Collaboration for Existing and Historic Buildings was founded almost exactly 4 years ago. Just looking back, it's about the ZNCC's birthday right now. And it was founded at the Association for Preservation Technology International Conference. And the goal was really to bring together mainstream, I'll say quote unquote, mainstream design, conservation, and sustainability groups to really have this conversation in an integrated way. So the original founding partners were APT, EMOS, the RAIC, the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada, and the American Institute of Architects, and Architecture 2030. And I think the benefit of this collaboration is that all of these groups have such deep technical knowledge and such a wide reach within their own communities that we're really able to kind of bring all these perspectives together to further the conversation of how existing buildings and reuse of existing buildings can accelerate climate action.
All right. Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Lorri. And before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask you what the future looks like, or what should it look like in terms of the sustainability and conservation of the built environment.
Yeah, what does the future look like? Well, I think everyone understands that we're in a time of rapid change, and there's such an urgency around social issues, around climate action, that the field of conservation does have to change. We can't afford to stay the same. And our existing buildings and heritage structures can't afford to be stagnant either. I think we're at a place where we have to manage change, not stop it. And so I think we really need to claim our seat at the table here as the heritage conservation community. We have deep technical knowledge about historic building materials, about how to use local materials and local labor, about how buildings can adapt over time through different uses, through different climates. And we have all of this knowledge, but rather than use it to stop change or to be seen as naysayers, getting down to the detail of a window, like don't touch my window, we can be seen as people who bring solutions, who can harness this knowledge to demonstrate how heritage structures can actually be assets towards climate action. And so I think that's the challenge I put forth to this community, is to really step up and aggressively integrate into this climate conversation so that we can lead in a really positive direction proactively.